All right, everybody. Today I'm going to share with you one of my favorite pastimes when I'm not out there training and diving into my own training data, and that is hopping on Strava and picking people to follow that I find interesting for one reason or another. And it's bonus if they provide a lot of supplementary commentary either on Strava or during through other means or other communication areas to kind of really give you a full look at what they're doing and why. And one of the more interesting groups of people for me are these like professional runners that are like Olympic caliber, like marathoners or track and field athletes, because it's pretty rare that these individuals will actually let you in to the degree that someone who's very public facing would, where they let you see all of their training, they give you detailed journals, they share about it on other social media channels, put it up on podcasts or talk about it on podcasts, and really give you a real deep look into their lifestyle and how impressive it actually is. So I'm going to use one here to show you that I think it does about as good a job, if not the best job out there right now, is Rory Linkletter. So Rory's very unique for some of those reasons I mentioned. He has his own podcast. He's a frequent guest on other podcasts. He's been on my podcast a couple of times to talk about some of his races and training and everything that goes into what he's up to. And he's also someone who posts everything to Strava. And he doesn't just throw it up there and leave it for you to digest. He actually adds commentary and some stuff on there that can help you maybe understand a little bit more about what the workout was and what went into it and everything like that. And then on top of that, since he has his own podcast, is a guest on a podcasts often and shares a lot of content outside of just Strava. If you pay attention to him and everything he's up to, then you can really get a full picture and idea of what it's like to be a world-class professional marathon runner. So I'm going to show you some of the stuff that I found really interesting on his profile that stood out to me and gave me some motivation to get out and do some training when I was looking at what I had to do. And I'll share the screen here so you can see what that looks like while I walk through it. But here's his kind of his overview of what he's been doing for essentially the last year or so. And one thing Rory's been talking about more frequently on podcasts is that he is curious and interested in finding where that kind of volume ceiling is for him as he develops in his career. So essentially, the way I interpret that is building volume isn't a weekly, monthly, or even a yearly thing when you're someone like Rory or someone who wants to make running a big part of your lifestyle. Building volume can be a multi-year, decade type process where you are moving through different cycles and phases of your career. And as you're doing that, you're adding more volume to it to the where you get to a point where eventually you find this spot where, all right, more is probably not going to be better for me anymore. And I've kind of tapped that opportunity to its fullest, and you work within that context from there. So Rory's still relatively young as far as running goes in general. He's well into his marathon career, but he's been talking a bit more about that idea of just, I don't think I've quite gotten to my peak volume yet in terms of what my body can physically tolerate within the context of the demands that I need in order to produce fast marathon times. And he's sort of exploring that. And you can kind of see that if you look at his training more recently, where he is pushing up to some historic highs compared to what he would have done in the past. And one example I pulled here is this. I think this is maybe his biggest week during this training cycle, which was 138.8 miles, 15 hours, 13 minutes of running, about 4,500 feet of elevation. Rory's based out of Flagstaff, so I'm sure he can find hills if he wants to, but Boston is probably one of the hilliest races he'll typically do. So for him to go seek that out is probably less of a input for him personally. But anyway, that's the context or the framework in which he is working is these like roughly 130-mile weeks that he's trying out. One other thing he mentioned on the podcast I found really interesting is he's getting in more interested in like the Japanese running culture, which actually in some cases employs like 3-a-day running, which I know like the American distance mind kind of goes to like, okay, there's singles and doubles. Well, if you go over to Japanese run culture, 3-a-days aren't something that is super unfamiliar to people who follow the pros and the high volume training out that way. So you'll even see some of that show up in his training. if you span into some of these weeks and look at the details a little bit more acutely. But one thing I like to do after you kind of see this, because it's one thing to run this much volume, it's another thing to see what is involved in it and what that all kind of plays out at. And there's some really good examples in here. So one is Rory recently did the New York City half marathon. And as you can kind of tell by just looking at this, it didn't really get much of a taper. So he was basically training through it. And you see this little dip right here, which is basically the week of the race. So he did a little bit of freshening probably to accommodate that, but before and after. But really, it's just kind of like sandwiched in between these 130-mile training weeks. So it's very much just, all right, I'm going to move through this, keep my eye on the prize for him, which is Boston this year. And when you look at that within this context, it gets really impressive. So this is his race at New York, ran 60 minutes flat. It's a 4:31 pace per mile. And you look at just like the pacing here, because this is not a flat course, and it was a competitive race. So he had a lot of surging and race tactics that went into it. Whereas I think if Rory was thinking, all right, I want to run as fast as I possibly can here, you're better off having someone pace at a pretty consistent effort versus having to respond to surges and things like that. And this is kind of what I'm talking about, where it's really cool when these people share some of the context for that. So, like, he's got some information up here with respect to kind of how all that played out. He talks about it on his podcast and things too. So, it's a really interesting piece of information to have available. But it is kind of fun to look at the actual mile splits here too, where you have some incredibly fast miles. Imagine a 4:11 mile in the middle of a half marathon. And granted, this one was on one of the more downhill spots on the course, and you can kind of get an idea of maybe what that looks like too by finding its counter. So like right here, this was about an equivalent scenario but uphill at 440. So imagine having a 4:11 split pop up on your watch, downhill or otherwise, when you have 10 miles left in a half marathon, and then a couple miles later having to go uphill at a 440 pace with 8 miles left in the half marathon. And I think the thing that was really interesting to me about this is we've got his heart rate data here too. And we got to be careful with heart rate because I don't know if he was using a wrist, arm, chest strap, or if this is accurate or not. But if we assume this heart rate is accurate, there's a lot of really cool things you can kind of tease out of that, which is what did his heart rate do as he progressed through this race? Because that can tell us things about how durable he is at this intensity, which could inform us as to like how confident are we that when he gets to Boston, he's going to knock it out of the park, get himself a PR, run a really good race, which for him will have to be impressive either way because he was his seventh at Boston last year and ran 2:06. So the cool thing about this is if this was unsustainable for him in a way that looked like, all right, maybe I'm less confident in his goals at Boston, we probably see this heart rate creep up as his pace stays the same, or his pace fall apart and the heart rate remain high. We don't see that. We see like just like almost a straight line as far as heart rate graphs go, and even a little down dip down there near the very, very end. And his pace, when you account for the course profile, is pretty even. So if we look at this, my friends at Training Peaks share with like what I'm kind of talking about here, which is understanding aerobic decoupling, which is essentially just that separation of heart rate and pace. So heart rate, if you can get accurate data, is going to be something that I think is going to tell us a little bit more about that. But that decoupling would just be something where if we start seeing like a split of higher than 5% between those two over the course of a run or between the first half and the second half of that run, that can tell us that, all right, there's some more development that needs to be done here versus you're in a really good spot with this intensity in terms of its durability over longer periods of time. So that's really interesting. And the other thing I always think about this stuff is you have these type of sessions, or in this case, race. It's one thing to do this and just like run yourself into the ground and then steal from the next session potentially because you did too much in any one session, and then the aggregate of everything you did ends up being lower than what it would be if you were just a little bit lighter on specific workouts. So when someone has a race like this, I would think, okay, well, what are they doing next? Are they able to get back into training? Is there a very low opportunity cost in terms of how much recovery time they need to get back to doing quality work versus having a scenario where now Rory needs a full week of just real easy running or lower volume and things like that to recoup all his energies and strengths and everything like that. So we can just pop into the next week and find his next quality session, and here it is. So it looks like he absorbed that very nicely to the degree where he had a little bit of a pullback in volume for the week itself to accommodate some of that, and then right back to it, 130-mile week. And this is a quality session he had within it, which was basically like a two-part workout where he reversed direction after finishing the first part and just did the same thing backwards on the second half. And it was a couple of kilometer repeats at 446, 441 pace with a pretty small little recovery in there, a minute in between. And then he started hopping right into 400s from there. And then he's hitting low 4-minute pace for these friends, just like clockwork, minute off in between. And then he gets a very small break, 90 seconds, to repeat that process from the other end. And this time, he actually starts pushing down the pace a little bit and even starts hitting some 60-second quarters there, dipping under 4-minute mile pace for some of these in the very end of that before finishing off with a couple more kilometers, 436, 439. So really strong workout. Obviously, if you're targeting the type of paces he is for the marathon, this is the type of work that drives that sort of goal to be doable. I think that sums up a lot of kind of the cool parts of it. You can kind of follow these things live as they're happening. And then, like I said before, if you're able to pair these up with other pieces of content they put out there, like YouTube videos, podcasts, social media posts, and things like that, it really gives you a very interesting look into their lives. And it is just really rare that someone of Rory's caliber is going to share that much information with you. So when I see someone doing that, I like to give them a bit of a shout out and thank them for giving us a peek into what they're doing and continue to let us draw some motivation from it.